My name is Jacob from Preseem, and myself and Harneet from Preseem will be coordinating today's webinar. I want to start by welcoming Dan Siemon. Dan is one of Preseem's co-founders and he leads product management. So over to you now, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's kind of cool to scan the list of people here and recognize many names like we already know. So that's pretty cool, and a bunch of new ones we don't as well. So my name's Dan Siemon. I'm one of the co-founders of Preseem. I've basically just super briefly about myself. I've worked with internet providers pretty much my whole career, or actually all my career. I owned a small internet provider. I worked as a network admin at one. I worked as a product manager for a larger equipment vendor, and very happy to still be in this space building stuff for the fixed wireless space right now. So in terms of the agenda for this, obviously the goal here is to introduce the spring edition of our fixed wireless report. First, I'm going to do just a very little brief introduction into Preseem. This isn't a product pitch. I think it's useful to understand, for those of you who aren't Preseem customers or know about Preseem, why we have this data at all and what we do with it. And I think it'll help inform the rest of the report and essentially, again, where the data comes from. Then I'm going to review some of the key findings of the report. There's a lot more stuff in the full document, which you'll be able to download at the end of the webinar than I'm going to talk about here. Basically just going to go through, I think it's 7 or 8 kind of interesting charts from the fixed report. Again, ton more detail there that kind of drills down into the different areas that it doesn't really make sense to do that in a webinar, because I'd just be bringing up chart after chart for an hour. So hopefully give you a flavor of what's there, and then you can dig into the full document afterwards. And then we also have this little bonus material. We had a customer a few weeks back ask us to get them a little bit of data comparing EPMP 2000 and 3000. So we thought it would be useful, since we had already calculated that, to make a little bonus feature for those of you who've taken the time to join the webinar today. So that's not in the fixed report. It's maybe a preview of the kind of thing we'll do in future editions, but hopefully you'll get a little extra value out of that as well. And again, thanks for taking the time to join us. So very quickly, what do we do? So basically we help WISPs measure, analyze, and improve the quality experience of their network. I'm only going to talk about the measuring and analyzing part today, because that's the basis of the data for the fixed wireless report. Our traffic management capabilities on the improving side of things, I'm not going to talk about that at all. So what do we do? So on the measure side, we basically extract quality of experience metrics directly from the subscriber's traffic. So by watching the packets flow from the end device in the home all the way to the server and back again, essentially. And in doing this, we can get a really good picture of the actual service that's delivered to the customer all the way down to the home. This is in contrast with a kind of, I'll call it traditional network monitoring, where you might ping individual network elements, for example, to measure latency. That can work, but it doesn't necessarily give you a great picture of what the subscriber's doing, because there can be different network paths and stuff that the management traffic can take. There could be different QoS markings applied to them, et cetera. So it can sometimes be misleading. It's still necessary to do, but it can sometimes be misleading. So our approach is to extract it directly from the subscriber's traffic. And in doing so, we can get very fine-grained latency measurements, throughput, loss, retransmits, and then we can roll that all up into towers, access points, and subscribers to give our customers a view of the quality on those levels, which kind of match the way that they typically think about the business. And then we augment these metrics extracted from the subscriber traffic by reaching out to other systems. So we get some information from the billing system, things like plans. We also get radio level metrics directly from the access points. So retransmits, CCR for Ubiquity, wireless retransmits for Cambium, et cetera. And then we kind of pull that all together and try to give this view of network quality. So you can dig into individual network metrics on a low level. This is a screen for a Rocket 5 AC Prism. This shows some of our metrics, again, extracted directly from the subscriber traffic. But if you were to scroll this down, you'd be able to see all the lower level radio metrics as well, which are extracted from the AP. So this is a raw view, essentially a way to go in and debug things. However, we usually expect our customers to spend most of the time at the higher level views. Things like this. So because we have data from a large number of ISPs and tens of thousands of access points, we're able to build a model of what the access points are capable of. So every day, for every model we see at every channel width, we calculate a model of the actual throughput in terms of latency, download rate, and upload rate. And then we can present that as an overlay when our customers look at their own access points. So you'll see this as a basis for a lot of the things we're going to talk about in the fixed wireless report in a couple minutes. In this particular example, if you look at the bottom half of that little screenshot, you can see this is a Rocket 5 AC at 20 megahertz, and then you can see that it's well below that orange line. And that orange line represents the expected throughput of that model based on, again, on all of our customers across the whole customer base. So this is really useful to find out if you have underperforming APs, so if they're flatlining well below that orange line, or if you have an AP that's maxed out, if it's flatlining around that orange line, that's a pretty good sign that you're probably at the capacity. Like that's all anyone else is getting out of that AP. You probably aren't going to get any better out of it either. So that's often how these type of metrics will be used. And we also roll up all the data we collect into higher level derived metrics. And one of those is the daily wireless summary. Basically what we do is we have a demand metric where we find the busiest minutes of the day, and then we calculate the QoE metrics for those minutes. And the intuition here is that an idle network at 3 a.m. or 8 a.m., maybe not in COVID time, but 8 a.m., that probably always delivers a good experience. It's really when the network or the access point gets busy that it doesn't. So we want to find those worst times, and then we want to use those to present, to measure the QoE and present that as like a daily summary. So this view has a whole bunch of interesting metrics, but the two that I want to talk about because they're very relevant to the fixed wireless report is busy hours and the oversubscription ratio there. Busy hours is basically the number of minutes of the day that the access point spends over 80% capacity. And the key thing here is that 80% capacity is based on what we observe over the tens of thousands of access points, not what's on the marketing spec sheets or some manually configured value. So this is really interesting to understand which APs are near capacity for hours of the day. So if you're at capacity for 6 hours a day, that's longer than the typical time period, and that's probably a pretty strong indication that that access point's overloaded. May still be delivering a good quality experience, but it's definitely going to be in trouble eventually. And similarly, the oversubscription ratio, which we'll also talk about when we get into the fixed wireless report, that's basically a measure of how much bandwidth is sold on the access point as compared to what it can actually deliver, again, in the real world. So useful for setting operational targets and identifying APs that have free capacity. So if you have an AP with very low oversubscription ratio, that might be an AP that you can sell more capacity on, sell more plans without having to upgrade the access point. So customers will use it for that as well. So that's really all I'm going to say about Preseem. I mean, this is why we have this data, is that we want to present the view of the network quality and overall congestion and reasons why there could be poor quality to our customers. And because of that, we collect a lot of metrics, probably about 10 billion metrics a day. Last time I looked at it, it's a very large number. Creates a lot of data to analyze. But it does give us, I think, a relatively unique view into the fixed wireless space. And because we have this data, we wanted to put together something that would provide value both to our customers and also to the wider WISP community, because I think we can show some interesting trends and results that are hard to get from other places. So because of that, we created the fixed wireless report. The first edition was 2 WISPapaloozas ago. So this one, it represents the 4th edition. We generally do a larger update in the fall, and then the spring update for WISPapalooza is mostly an update of the fall one with the most recent data from our pretty rapidly growing customer base. And of course, since there was no WISPapalooza this year, we decided to do a webinar to launch this today. Just to talk a little bit again about where the data comes from, it's based entirely on Preseem customers. Primarily that's in the US, though we do have customers all over the place, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, Australia, South Africa, Spain, a whole bunch of different places. But on balance, the bulk of the customers are in the US. And this is based on a 2-week period that just before WISPapalooza. So we basically snap a decent sized time period and then run the report and prep it for, prep it for WISP America. In terms of the data, there's a little comment in the document as well when you read it. This is entirely based on Preseem customers. So this isn't go out and find 100 random WISPs and see what they're doing. So to any extent, there's some form of like natural bias in customers that work with Preseem or something. There would be bias in the data as well. However, I think our customer base is getting to the point now that, that's not likely to be true. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move into just talking through some of the high-level metrics, and then the bonus material, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So one of the first things we often get asked about is subscriber usage. So this is a view of daily download usage. And the way this is calculated is you could basically think of, we treated all of the subscribers on all of our customers as one giant ISP, and then just looked at the usage of individual subscribers. And here you can see 31% of subscribers use less than 1 gigabyte per day, and 15% of subscribers use over 16 gigabytes a day. So if you take 16 times it by 30, you get 480 gig in a month. Or of course, if you're less than 1 gig, you get less than 30 gig a month. So there's still a lot of people that don't use much internet. That's probably not surprising, and there's still a bunch that use a lot more. The tail actually drags out a little more than this. We just chose to limit to 16 buckets just so the chart isn't totally insane, but it does continue to tail out like that for a little while. So it's interesting to see, you can look up old versions of the report and compare how this has changed, but it hasn't really changed substantially in the last couple editions. The other thing that we always get asked, and actually was one of the motivators for doing the first edition of the report, because we were asked so often, is we get asked about access point market share. A lot of customers want to get a sense of what other people are using, what they're having success with or not. And we obviously have that data, so we put that into the first edition of the report. And what's interesting about the access points in terms of market share is it depends a lot in how you measure. So this first chart here shows the access point market share by subscribers. So this is a count of subscribers attached to that vendor's access points. You can see Ubiquiti, about 40%, 46%, sorry. Cambium, about 43%. So, pretty close to each other in terms of market share when you look at subscribers. However, if you jump over to looking at this by network elements, you get a pretty different picture. Ubiquiti is 49% and Cambium's 33%. So if that's not intuitive, the reason for this, and we'll see in a couple of slides when we look at the different models, is that there's several Cambium access point models that support a much higher subscriber density than Ubiquiti. So that's why they're able to essentially cover the same amount of subscribers with a fewer number of network elements. So I guess either one of these, they could claim it's a tie, or they could claim that one vendor has a bigger market share than the other, depending on which of these metrics they want to look at, again, by subscribers or by access point. We do also, in the full version of the report, which I'm not going to show that slide here, we have market share by, I think, the top 10 different access point models, not just vendors. And that's pretty interesting too, to see what's actually used in the field. Connected subscribers by AP. This is simply the number of people of radios, basically, that are connected to an access point. This one was, I think, in the second edition of the report. It might have been in the first one. I was certainly surprised the first time I saw it. I was surprised to see that there's almost, more 73% of access points have less than 10 subscribers attached. I guess that kind of makes sense in retrospect, just because you have APs that support a relatively small number, and you also have APs deployed in very remote areas where maybe there's a small number of subscribers that could attach. But still, I was pretty surprised that there was that many with that few of subscribers. And what this means for the access point vendors, I don't know. Maybe it's interesting to them to see that maybe there's a bigger market for smaller APs than they might otherwise think there is. So we can maybe talk in the comments or questions at the end if that's intuitive or surprising to people as well. But it has held pretty steady through all the editions or reports that we've looked at this. The numbers stayed basically in the 70s. This is connected subscribers by access point model. Before I do this, I want to explain the average and the 95th percentile here because it's really important. It's explained in the document as well, but it's pretty important. This chart is connected stations, obviously is the y-axis there. And average is simply sum up all the subscribers attached to that model and then divide by the number of the model. So this gets you a good picture of what's actually happening in the field. But because there can be an access point that was, say it was just put up yesterday and it had 1 subscriber, or it's an access point put in a very remote area that's only ever going to have 2 subscribers, it tends to bring the average down a lot. So although the average gives you a good picture of what's actually happening, it doesn't give you a good picture of what that model's actually capable of. So to try to get what the model's capable of, we look at the 95th percentile. If the percentile is a scary math word, it basically just means that 95% of the access points have fewer subscribers than this value and 5% have higher. So we're trying to get to the APs that are operating kind of near the limit of their capacity and then present that number as an indication of what that AP can do. Again, so think of average as how it's being used, and P95 is basically what it's capable of. So I'll talk mostly about the 95th percentile values as we go through the rest of these charts. And again, you'll see that approach taken throughout the document as well. So in this case, if you look at Rocket 5 AC, 28 subscribers attached at the 95th percentile. EPMP 2000 is a little bit higher at 31, just looking at those first 2 bars. But if you jump all the way over to the far right, you guys who've looked at previous editions of the report will recognize this pattern that the PMP 450 just kind of dominates from a magnitude perspective in all the charts. So the P95 there is about 95 connected subscribers per access point. We do see instances of 130, 150 subscribers attached to those. So that would be, if we looked at the 99th percentile or something like that. So pretty interesting, I think. Probably, not super surprising, just given I think everybody recognizes that the 450 takes a lot more capacity, or can handle a lot more capacity than some of these other models, but it's interesting to see it spread out there. Maybe one thing that's surprising is how close the EPP 2000 and the PMP 450, not the 450M are, but yeah, I'm not sure if that's surprising to people or not. Download throughput, also very interesting. Similar approach, P95 trying to get at what the model's capable of. Here we see a Rocket 5 AC, 61 megabits per second, EPMP about 59 megabits per second, and again, the giant tall bar is a 450M. And here you'll see, if you look on the far right, the EPMP 3000 is another tall bar, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes when we get to that little bonus section. One thing here is that the Rocket 5 AC, that number's been creeping up a little over the editions of the reports. That may be because there's more customers switching to AC. I'm not exactly sure why that's happening, but it's definitely been slowly increasing through all the last 4 editions. Another thing we look at in the report is how customers use channels. So essentially, do they use channels in order to get more capacity, or sorry, wider channels to get more capacity, or do they use it to deploy to more customers? So those charts are in the document. The one thing I wanted to extract from that was a little comparison of what happens when you go from 20 megahertz to 40 megahertz channels. So the left-hand side, you have a Rocket 5 AC. On the right-hand side, you have an EPMP 2000. Those are just picked because they're 2 of the most common models. So if you go from a 20 megahertz channel to a 40 megahertz channel, that's 100% increase in channel width. But for the 5 AC Prism, you get a 52% increase in throughput. And for the EPMP, you get a 44% increase in throughput. So we're not in the business of buying, deploying, or selling access points. So I don't really know if this is good or bad, and I'm not in any way an RF expert. So this is very interesting to me. I mean, maybe something we could talk about in the comment section at the end is, does this indicate that you'd be better off to deploy 2 APs at 20 megahertz than 1 at 40? Maybe. Again, there's probably people in the call that are much more of an RF expert than I am. So I'd be curious to hear what you guys take from these numbers, and if there's anything there that's useful for your own network planning. Oversubscription ratio, I mentioned this. This was added to the last edition of the report, the one that we did in for WISPAPalooza in the fall. We also show this in our product as well, and it's basically sum up all the subscriber plan rates on an individual access point, and then divide it by that real world model of what the access point is capable of. So again, not the marketing spec sheets, that what we see across tens of thousands of access points. And then we can just divide that out and get a ratio of how much bandwidth has been sold on the access point versus what it's capable of. And you can see most access points, or I guess the biggest bar of access points, about 28%, are between 1 and 2 times oversold. So this would mean if you had an AP capable of 10 megabits per second, these people have less than 20 megabits, or between 10 and 20 megabits sold on that access point. And again, when I first saw this, I was surprised. I thought the number would be more around the 4-5 ratio is kind of where the hump would be. Maybe that intuition was based on past kind of DSL deployments and stuff. But I guess when you think about it a little bit, you think back to the large number of access points with a small number of subscribers, it actually kind of makes sense that the hump here would be down at the bottom end of the distribution. And this, I mean, from a metric standpoint, this is primarily useful as a target to understand like how much can you, as like a business target, if I want to oversell my APs as a general rule of 5 times or 3 times or 2 times, and then you can use, well, you can measure it yourself, or you can use our product to understand where your individual APs are in that score. We also actually plot this based on the models in the fixed report, which is really interesting too, because there's several models that the hump is over at the 3 or 4, which indicates those models, WISPs are basically able to oversubscribe at higher ratios than other models. This chart is a combination of all possible models. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the interesting things in the report. As I mentioned, every one of those has a deeper dive that goes into per model, goes into other metric types. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of the type of stuff that's there. So now for a little bit of extra bonus information. As I mentioned, we had a customer ask us shortly before WISP America if we could give a little bit of data on EPMP 2000 versus the EPMP 3000. This wasn't done for any reason other than the customer asked us to do it. We didn't pick these models for any nefarious reason or anything like that. But since we had the data, we thought it would be useful to do that now and give you guys a little extra bonus for taking the time to join us today. So I'm going to go through 3 different metrics: connected stations. I'm going to download throughput and upload throughput, and then there's a slide that kind of summarizes them all, and we can sit there for a second. So in terms of connected stations or connected subscribers, at 20 megahertz, the EPMP 3000, again based on all of our data, does about 16% more subscribers than the EPMP 2000. That gets hard to say a whole bunch of times in a row. The EPMP 3000 does about 30% increase at 40 megahertz. And we'll see a pattern similar with that with all these other metrics. Why the difference between 20 and 40? You'll see that through all the charts. I don't know the answer to that. So in terms of download throughput at 20 megahertz, the pattern here is pretty much the same. I get a little better at the 20 megahertz. I got a 30% increase in download throughput for the 3000 versus the 2000. At 40 megahertz, there's about a 26% increase in the throughput. And in the upload side of things, it's actually a little bit inverted from the connected stations in that we have 17% increase of connected stations at 20 megahertz and about 30% increase at 40 megahertz. So just to summarize all that, the number of connected stations, and this is again comparing the 2000 to 3000, I'll just do the 40% numbers. It's 30% higher basically across the board at 40 megahertz over the EPMP 2000. So I don't know what that means. Again, we're not in the business of buying or deploying or selling access points. I have no idea what the price points of these models are or what other features make them attractive, et cetera. But maybe this is information that's useful if you're evaluating whether to upgrade to the 3000 or buy the 3000. And I think it's also something we'll probably want to spend a bit more time on going forward is presenting these kind of comparisons based on our data, because I believe, and you guys can comment in the chat there, if these kind of comparisons are useful when you're making decisions on what to deploy and what to buy for your network. So that was pretty quick. Basically, all of the webinar attendees are going to get a full, be able to download the full PDF from within the webinar. I think Jacob's going to release that to you guys. Probably he's clicking the button right now. You'll be able to download that full PDF. We do ask that you don't share it widely yet. We're going to do a public release of this next week. So in the meantime, if you want to kind of read about it, and you'll have all the knowledge soaked in already by the time we release it publicly to talk about it with other people. But hopefully you can get some value out of it before everyone else does. So thanks for taking the time to join us. Again, hopefully that was a useful picture of the data that's in the report, but we really weren't attempting to go through every single chart, because that would be an hour-long chart session of me just flipping through charts, and I'm not sure that that's the most valuable use of your time. Okay, so with that, we can move off to questions.
Now beginning our Q&A session with the first question. The question is, what about spectral efficiency, i.e. total throughput from an AP/channel width?
Yeah, so we do have, you guys will be able to open it up right now. I'm not sure if I can open up that and jump to that. That's actually an interesting idea. Can I? Well, we'll go back to there in a second. Maybe I can upload the report and I could jump over to it as well to show the different sections. But yes, we do have comparisons for a whole bunch of different models. And that's kind of where this comes from, for a whole bunch of different models at 20 megahertz and at 40 megahertz. So you can compare for a bunch of different dimensions for that. So I think that's probably what you mean by spectral efficiency. And this was kind of meant to just be a little summary of that. Like, it does not seem like you get 100% increase for 100% channel width, just based on what we observe in the real world.
Moving on to question 2. What about an in-depth chart of metrics down to the module number?
Module, actually, yeah. So this is great. I should have mentioned earlier as well. If you have ideas, please drop them in the chat. I mean, one thing that we're going to, in August and September, we'll be looking to do the next edition. So if you have ideas of things you'd like covered there, it's definitely a really good time to get that to us. We collect the data currently on individual SMs, what models they are and all that kind of stuff. We don't yet slice and dice this data by that. I think that would be a very fruitful endeavor, because if we could report the typical download rate by an individual SM model, or maybe whether it's in N mode or AC mode and that kind of stuff, or which framing mode it's in, that could be, I think, pretty highly valuable data, but we haven't done that yet.
Next up, question 3. The report has 15 modules, but we'd like to see a lot more. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's kind of a limit in the PDF format to how wide the charts can be. So I think we just picked a certain, whether it's 10 or something like that, of the 10 most common. We are working on a little addition to this that's going to be available to WISPA members, where you can see the top 25. It would be interesting for us to be able to publish this data in some way where you could see the entire distribution of access points. There is a real long tail there. Like, certain models will make up like 80% of all the customers. Probably that top 10 probably is 80-90% of the APs. But then there's a long tail after that. We should look at some way to expose that long tail, but yeah, we haven't done that yet. If there's something specific you want to know about, you can always message us, and assuming we have that, it's just not condensed into a pretty chart for the document, we could probably pull those numbers for you pretty quickly. One thing that we did, we started looking at 60 gigahertz, again, because we had a customer asked us, what's the performance of the 60 gigahertz APs? There's not a ton of them in the field yet, so we shared the data, but it wasn't huge numbers. It was, it was like 50 and 60 of the total instances of the 60 gigahertz APs, and with really low numbers, the information is just less useful. Like, for these common models, I don't even know what the number is right now. We see thousands of Rocket 5 ACs. So, that we can be much more confident in those numbers than an AP where we only see 50 of them.
And here's question number 4. Regarding Preseem, does all of the traffic have to pass through the Preseem appliance?
Yes, yeah, because So the metrics that we get via SNMP, obviously we don't need that there because we can collect radio level metrics, but all of the core of the metrics we get are collected directly from the subscriber traffic, and then we basically do that as it passes through the box at the same time that we're doing the traffic management stuff, which I didn't talk about at all today.
And the next question is there any data in regards to fixed frame versus flex frame models?
That's super interesting too. So that comes up. That is definitely something we should try to figure out. Along with the different SMs, we could certainly slice the 5AC, for example, by fixed framing, et cetera, and compare those bars, and that would, yeah, that's a good idea, and we should see if we can get that done for the fall.
This next question comes from Andrew. What do you feel is the most important metric to track for preventative maintenance? Do you think there are multiple metrics?
So I'll take preventative maintenance to mean keeping the quality of experience good over time. So definitely our latency and kind of the red green, we kind of summarize that as red, yellow, green sort of, so you can get a sense just at a really high level what's going on. Latency is a really, really strong indicator of quality of how customers perceive the internet, just because you can have a big download going on, but if your latency is still good, the web and things are still going to feel good, like in your gaming still going to work. So latency, tracking that over time, super useful. However, I do think that oversubscription ratio and that busy time are also really useful to be able to understand which APs are near the edge, even if they maybe are still giving low latency and low loss. It really gives a good way to identify those APs that may need some help, may need to be split, may need to be upgraded, et cetera. So I guess that's a little Preseem specific. I mean, if you're not asking in a general sense, um, latency to the AP itself isn't very useful because that's all in your network. Um, Look at loss. I mean, certainly Cambium's wireless level retransmit metric is pretty useful.
Question 7 is, do we need a Preseem appliance for each connection we have to the internet?
Yeah, basically we need to all the traffic needs to pass through. Yeah, so you could, um, yeah, so if you go too much into Preseem deployment stuff, I'm happy to, maybe we can schedule something afterwards for that. But yeah, essentially all the traffic needs to flow through a Preseem appliance. You could do that at the core, or you can do individual smaller boxes deployed with more of them. So we have some customers that have just by the network design they have 25 1 and 5 gig boxes, versus other customers have like one big 15 gig box. So it kind of depends how you want to do that. Our pricing models per subscriber, so we really don't care which model you use. And yeah, we're happy to go through a deployment exercise with anybody at any time.
Question 8 comes from Daniel. What about an in-depth cart of metrics down to the model number?
A card, like
Carts.
I'm not sure what that means.
Daniel explains a bit further. For the purpose of collecting metrics, is Preseem looking at getting deeper metrics such as the LAN of subscribers?
Yeah, it would be interesting to. We've talked to a couple of those guys about doing some kind of integrations. It would certainly be interesting because, I mean, although we measure the quality all the way into the home, we don't know which devices are doing what. So there's definitely some benefit there to having a device in the home that you manage. Certainly, bringing some of that data in and combining it with all the other stuff we have would have a bunch of value. So we've had discussions there, but it really hasn't become a priority quite yet.
And this one's from Carlin. When will you be hiring a statistician?
Yeah, exactly. I think that there's a couple of us that are as close as that's going to be for a while. There's certainly more we could do with this data. We want to try to make it as useful as possible, but the report really it's not the core of what we do. It's kind of obviously we do it because it has value and people learn about Preseem through that, but it's not the core of what we do. So I'm not sure if we're going to hire a full-time statistician, although we do have someone whose title is um, data scientist. So I guess that's probably close enough.
Question 10 comes from John. Any thoughts on LTE versus traditional vendors?
Yes, so it is definitely across our customer base, still a very low percent. We have very briefly started looking at that, and I think that would also be a pretty fruitful area for the next edition. Normal LTE, but also the LTEU stuff, because we're starting to see some LTEU. So it's yeah, that definitely would be useful to compare those in the cases we have enough customers using them that we can actually say something intelligent. But it is interesting to me as well how those are still relatively small slices of the market, or at least in our customer base.
Question 11 comes from Brad. Especially in regards to usage and throughput data, does that factor in speed plans and data caps in any way?
I tend to think of, so there's kind of, this is almost a little philosophical. I believe usage is a kind of orthogonal separate dimension from throughput. So generally you don't like sometimes people will think, this is kind of going off the rails from the report. Changing having a usage-based plan doesn't actually necessarily change the peak usage, because what happens is people will still use their usage all during the evening, say when they're watching Netflix or watching Disney Plus or whatever they're doing. And primarily an ISP's costs are driven by the peak capacity of the network. So at the core, at the access point, et cetera. So although usage-based billing can be an approach to kind of raise revenue and segment the market, which is, can be a useful goal, it generally is not going to be that effective in changing the quality of experience for customers, because again, everyone's still going to use it at the same time anyway. So I think a better approach there is to have more intelligent traffic management, that when the network peak is hit, customers still get a good experience rather than everything kind of going really bad, which is what happens if you don't have good queue management and stuff. As soon as the network gets near capacity, everyone's experience gets really, really bad. So I tend to think of those as two different things. Usage-based pricing is useful as a kind of marketing or revenue tool, and then you still need to have good traffic management capabilities to maintain a good experience, because the former won't really help that. That
Yeah.
was a little ranty. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you. Question 12 comes from Elizabeth, and she's asking, do you have all the data on upload speeds by equipment type? This is important for the upcoming RDOF auction.
We have a bunch of it. So we do collect subscriber module information today as well, and we haven't really made much use of it yet, to be honest. So we want to pull that into all of our models in the product as well, so we can use that as a help refine the prediction. So if you have a certain number of AC clients and N clients on the same AP, that might help us tweak and be a little more accurate if we can, based on the expected throughput of that AP. So we're working on that. We don't expose that anywhere yet. That's still kind of in the back end. We're playing with the data phase. But yeah, we do have it, and we will expose more of it over time. At the moment, it would be pretty hard to get that out in a format that would be useful, I think. But if you have a specific question there, I'm happy to brainstorm it. I mean, certainly the stuff that's useful for our customers will be things that we prioritize.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And this is one of our last questions. And question 13 comes from Daniel. Are there any efforts to identify, probably manually, the antenna associated with the AP?
Yeah, we haven't tried that. Anything that's manual, we would have to have some way for our customers to tell us that, which as soon as that happens, which is still useful to do, but as soon as that happens, all of a sudden it's a much smaller data set, because only some customers would populate it. And really, I think that the value of these metrics is when it covers a very large number of APs, because that's going to have the most accuracy. So no, we haven't looked at antenna type. I think we'll probably do the subscriber module stuff first and then maybe think about that. But yeah, we haven't done that yet.
And coming up to our last question now, this is from Christopher. Do you have any comparison of provision speeds versus typical peak usage?
We definitely have the data. I don't know that we have it summarized anywhere. So in the body of the report, there's a section which shows the kind of typical upload and download rate across all subscribers. but that's not segmented by the plan rates. That's basically just treating everybody as having, a global plan sort of thing. We could certainly slice that by everybody with a 10 meg plan and below and a 15 meg plan and 20 meg plan, but no, we haven't done that yet. It's interesting though. It would be worth exploring that.
That concludes the Q&A portion of this webinar and the webinar as a whole. Thank you once again to Dan for presenting us with the insights contained in this new fixed wireless network report, and thank you to all of you in the audience for joining.